Robinson stood them in the sun for a few days. When they were dry, he tried to cook some soup in one of them. He filled it with water and put it on his stove or oven. But how sadly had he deceived himself! In a short time the water soaked into the clay, and soon the pot had fallen to pieces. "How foolish I am!" said Robinson to himself. "The pots have to be fired before they can be used." He set about this at once. He found two stones of equal size, placed them near each other, and laid a third across these. He then placed three large pots upon them, and made a hot fire under them. No sooner had the flames shot up than one of the pots cracked in two. "I probably made the fire too hot at first," thought Robinson. He drew out some of the coals of wood, but afterwards gradually increased the fire again. He could not, however, get the pots hot enough to turn red. He brought the driest and hardest wood, but could not succeed in getting them hot enough to turn red. At length he was tired out, and was compelled to give up. When the pots were cool, he tried to boil water in one. It was no better than the sun-dried one. He saw now that he must provide some way to get the pots much hotter than he could in the open air. He resolved to make an oven of stones large enough to take in the wood as well as the pots. It must be above ground, so that there might be plenty of draught for fire. With great labor he pried up and carried together flat stones, enough to make an oven about 4 feet high, with a chimney at one side. He had put in the center a stone table, on which he could place 3 quite large pots. He left an opening in one side that could be partially closed by a large flat stone. He worked eagerly, and at the end of the second day he was ready to fire his oven. He first carried together a good quantity of dry wood. Then he put in his pots, and laid the wood around them. In a short time he had a very hot fire. He kept this up all day and until late at night. The next morning he went to his oven and found his pots were a beautiful red. He drew out the fire and allowed them to cool slowly. Then he filled one with water and set it over the fire to heat it. Before many minutes the water was boiling, and Robinson had another reason to be thankful. He wept for joy. His patient labors had brought their rewards. No prince could feel as happy as Robinson now. He had overcome all difficulties. Starting with nothing but his hands, he was now able to supply all his wants. "If I only had a companion now," he thought, "I would have nothing further to wish as long as I stay on the island." Chapter 30. Robinson as Potter. Chapter 31. Robinson as Baker. Now that Robinson had fire, he determined to try to make bread. He had seen the servants at home make bread many times, but he had not observed closely and knew next to nothing about the way bread is made. He knew he must in some way grind the corn into flour, but how could he do this? He had no mill nor any tools with which to crush the corn. He first tried to find a stone large and hard enough out of which he might hollow a vessel or kind of mortar. He thought he could put the corn into this mortar and grind it by means of another stone or pestle. It was with great difficulty that he could get a stone of suitable size and form. After several days' trial, he at last got one cut out from some layers of rock near the shore. He made a hollow place in it. Then he took a smaller oblong-shaped rock for his pestle. He took great pride in these new tools. "I shall soon be a stone cutter," he said to himself, "as well as a farmer and a potter." But his stone mortar was a failure. The rock was too soft. Every time he thrust the pestle down, it loosened small pieces of the stone vessel. These mixed with the ground corn or flour and made it unfit to eat. There was no way to separate the sand from the crushed grain. He resolved then to try to make a mortar and pestle of hard wood. Now that he had fire, he could do this, though it cost him many a hard day's work. He found, not far away, a log of very hard wood. By building a fire at the right distance from one end, he was able to separate a piece of the log. He rolled this to his cave and made a good sized hollow in it by burning. This pestle was not so difficult to make. He took a limb or branch of an ironwood tree, burned it in two at the place to make it the right length. By burning also he rounded one end, and then he was ready for the grinding. After cleaning his mortar and pestle carefully, he placed some corn in the hollow and soon had some fine yellow meal or flour without any grit or sand in it. His next care was to separate the coarse outer husk or covering of the kernel from the finer parts that make the meal. He had no sieve. His net was too coarse. It let both bran and meal go through. I must make a net or cloth fine enough to sift or to bolt my flour, said he. Such was now his skill in spinning and weaving that this was not hard to do. He had soon woven in his loom a piece of fine netting which allowed the meal to shake through, but held back the coarse bran or outer husk of the kernel. Out of the dry corn that he had stored up, he now made quite a quantity of flour. This he kept tightly covered in a large earthen pot or jar that he had made for this purpose. I must keep all my food clean and protected from the ants and other insects, as well as dust and damp, he thought. His preparations were now nearly made. He had already his stove of flat stones. On this he could set his pots to boil water, cook rice and meat, but it would not do for baking a loaf of bread of any thickness. He must have an oven or enclosed place into which he could put the loaf to bake it. By the use of flat stones he soon rebuilt his stove so as to have an oven that did fine service. Now it was mixing the dough that claimed his attention. He had, of course, no yeast to make raised or light bread. He poured goat's milk on the flour and kneaded it into a thick dough. He did not forget to add salt. He placed his loaf in a shallow earthen pan he had made for this purpose. After the fire had heated the stones of his oven through, he put in his loaf and soon was enjoying a meal of cornbread and meat stew. Robinson soon tried to make cocoa from the beans of the cocoa palm that grew in the island. This with good rich goat's milk in it, he thought, the best drink in the world. He often thought of making sugar from the sugarcane plant he had discovered in the island, but the labor of squeezing out the juice was too great. He could think of no way to do this without the help of horses or oxen. Chapter 31. Robinson as baker. Chapter 32. Robinson as fisherman. Robinson was now eager to use his fire and cooking vessels. He had noticed with hungry eyes fine large fish in the creek near his cave, but he had never taken the trouble to catch any. "What is the use?" he thought. "I cannot eat them raw." It was different now, and he began to devise ways of making a catch. How he longed for a fish hook, such as he had so often used when loitering along the Hudson River. "But a fish hook is not to be thought of," he said to himself, "unless I can make one of bone." He went down to the brook and searched long for a fish bone that he might make use of for this purpose. He found nothing. "I must try something else," he thought. He remembered the nets he used to see along the Hudson and wondered if he could not make a small one to pull through the water and thus catch the fish. He had now a better source of fiber for weaving and for spinning into lines and ropes. He had discovered this when he was trying to find a good strong thread or yarn with which to bind the coils of his grass-made baskets together. He obtained fiber in great abundance from the century-like plant. He found if he broke off the long leaves of this plant and allowed them to decay, there remained a long, tough, fibrous substance out of which strong cords could be twisted or yarn made for weaving a coarse cloth or netting. Out of this he spun yarn thread to make a net about 3 or 4 feet by 2 feet. He fastened cords to 4 corners of this, tied them to a long pole, and was now prepared to test his plan for catching fish.